The air buzzed with the hum of rolling suitcases and overhead announcements as Amara Fields stepped through the glass gates of JFK International Airport, her sleek black heels clicking confidently against the polished floor, her braided hair crowned like a halo, her tailored navy power suit hugging her tall frame with the elegance of royalty, a Cartier watch peeking from beneath her cuff and catching the fluorescent lights with every movement. Amara was the CEO of Fields Tech, a revolutionary AI cybersecurity company valued at over $2.1 billion, the youngest black female CEO on the Forbes 100, and she was boarding Flight 877 to San Francisco for a keynote speech at the Global Innovation Summit, a speech anticipated by thousands, streamed by millions, and potentially pivotal in landing a government contract worth hundreds of millions in federal infrastructure security. But none of that would matter, at least not for the next hour, because something utterly absurd was about to happen, and it would begin with a smug smirk and a stolen seat. As she approached gate to 3A, her first-class boarding pass in hand, her assistant, Janelle, buzzed her Bluetooth to confirm that her presentation was uploaded to the summit cloud and that the Department of Defense CTO would be attending her keynote in person. Amara, already mentally rehearsing her closing lines, barely noticed the red-lipped gate agent who barely glanced at her ticket before waving her through without so much as a greeting, her disinterest sharp as glass. Amara had grown used to this, the dismissive glances, the upticks, the hesitation that often shadowed surprise when people realized that, yes, she was the CEO, and no, she wasn't the assistant, the intern, or the entertainment, but she didn't flinch anymore. She simply nodded, walked past the boarding tunnel with the poise of a monarch, and prepared to sink into her first-class window seat, 1A, when she stopped dead in her tracks. A tall, middle-aged white man with a salt and pepper beard, a Patagonia vest, and an entitled aura was sitting in her seat, legs crossed, sipping sparkling water, scrolling through a Bloomberg article on his iPad as if the plush leather belonged to him by birthright. When she cleared her throat, he didn't even look up, and when she said, politely but firmly, "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat," he turned toward her with the lazy arrogance of a man who'd gotten away with 1,000 little thefts in his life and sneered, "I don't think so, sweetheart, this is 1A, and I've been flying this route every month for 20 years. Amara blinked, then smiled tightly, producing her boarding pass like a weapon and adding, "I'm sure you have, but today that seat belongs to me, see here." But the man didn't even glance at her ticket. He waved his hand dismissively and muttered, "They probably made a mistake, check with the flight attendant," then turned back to his iPad like she was a passing breeze. As the flight attendant approached a young blonde woman with a pixie cut and a rushed expression, Amara explained the situation calmly, expecting a quick resolution, but instead the attendant barely glanced at the screen and said, "Sir, may I see your ticket?" The man presented it with a flourish and, to everyone's surprise, it read 4C, a seat in business class. "Looks like this isn't your seat," the flight attendant said, her tone carefully neutral. But the man only scoffed and said, "Well, I'm not moving, there must have been a mistake, and I'm not going to squeeze into some middle row seat like a sardine." His voice rising now, drawing glances from the other passengers. Amara's jaw tightened, her patience thinning, but she kept her voice composed. "That's not a middle seat. It's a perfectly fine seat, and more importantly, it's your seat. This one is mine." But the flight attendant hesitated. Instead of enforcing the manifest and asking the man to move, she said, "Miss, would you mind sitting in for C just for takeoff? We'll sort it out in the air." The insult hit like a slap. Miss, and no, she would not mind because she paid for this seat. She earned it with every sleepless night, every boardroom battle, every strategic acquisition that grew Fields Tech, from her kitchen table to Wall Street. And now she was being asked to yield it to a man who simply refused to accept a black woman in first class. "No," she said clearly, her voice low and slicing, "I will not move. I purchased 1A. That's what my boarding pass says. I expect it to be respected." The attendant stiffened, then murmured, "Let me speak with the captain," before disappearing into the cockpit as the cabin around them grew uncomfortably quiet. The man in her seat chuckled under his breath and said, "Some people just can't let things go," to no one in particular, but loud enough for Amara to hear. She turned to face him fully, her voice crisp, "And some people think they're entitled to things they didn't earn. You're not in your seat, you're not entitled to mine." The tension crackled like static. 1 minute later, the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of the captain, calm but unusually firm, "we are temporarily grounding Flight 877 due to a passenger incident. Please remain seated until further notice." The man looked up, confused. Amara didn't flinch. The door to the cockpit opened and out stepped the pilot, Captain Rios, a tall woman with Latina features and sharp eyes that scanned the cabin in an instant. She walked directly to Amara. "Miss Fields." Amara nodded. "I was just informed of the issue. May I see your boarding pass?" Amara handed it over without hesitation. Captain Rios examined it, nodded, then turned to the man in 1A. "You are in violation of FAA policy by refusing to comply with seating assignments. I must ask you to vacate the seat immediately, or I'll be forced to remove you from the flight." The man sputtered, "This is ridiculous. I'm a platinum member. I've got more status than half this plane." But Captain Rios's face didn't budge. "Status does not supersede protocol. If you do not move in the next 30 seconds, I will call security," he blanched. People were now filming with their phones. Still, he tried one more time. "Why should I be the one to move when she—" Captain Rios cut him off. "Because she's the one who followed the rules. And because she paid for that seat." That moment broke him. His shoulders slumped. He stood up, muttering something under his breath, and stalked down the aisle, his face flushed with fury and humiliation. The flight attendant returned, flustered, apologizing half-heartedly, but Amara didn't look at her. She simply sat in her rightful seat, unfolded her iPad, and began reviewing her slides like nothing had happened, because to her, this was not new, this was not shocking, this was not rare, this was simply Tuesday. Outside the terminal, news had already begun to spread. A video had been uploaded of the confrontation. The headline read, "Black female CEO denied first-class seat by white passenger, then pilot intervenes." It was trending by the time they reached cruising altitude. But Amara didn't care about viral fame. She cared about truth and power and making space where people like her were so often pushed aside. And today, she'd made space. Not with violence, not with rage, but with unyielding grace, razor-sharp resolve, and the quiet fury of a woman who had spent her entire life proving she belonged. By the time Flight 877 touched down in San Francisco, the internet had ignited like a dry field struck by lightning, and Amara Fields, who had calmly taken her rightful seat after a brief but telling standoff, emerged from the jetway into a terminal. Buzzing with more than just business travelers and coffee carts, it buzzed with recognition. Whispers, iPhones subtly angled her way, journalists texting furiously, and airport staff stepping aside with nervous glances. Because the video of the CEO who wouldn't give up her seat had gone viral. Not just a clip now, but a symbol, a lightning rod, a turning point in a conversation far bigger than a plane ride. And Amara, tired from the emotional labor disguised as another routine act of self-defense, straightened her spine, adjusted the gold pin on her lapel, and prepared to step into a new kind of storm, one she hadn't planned for, but one she had long been trained to weather. In the 23-minute flight delay that had followed the seat confrontation, the clip had racked up over 2 million views, retweeted by celebrities, civil rights lawyers, politicians, and CEOs, some genuinely outraged, others performatively woke, some using her name like a hashtag while others shouted her story. Without knowing her name at all, but the image that cut through it all was stark. Amara standing in the aisle, poised, elegant, unyielding, contrasted against the red-faced man, slouched in her seat, refusing to move, and in that one image, 1,000 stories burned behind every stare Amara had ever ignored. Every microaggression she'd swallowed like poison, every time she'd had to smile in boardrooms while being mistaken for the secretary. She'd dealt with bias her entire life, from Harvard classrooms where professors assumed she was in the wrong seminar, to Silicon Valley investor meetings where white VCs grilled her on fundamentals while praising her white male counterparts for vision. But none of those battles had ever been recorded. None had ever been so viscerally public. And now, every second of her journey from gate to cabin to confrontation had become a prism through which America debated everything from racial bias to first-class access to the subtle privileges so often unnoticed by those who held them like birthrights. Still, Amara didn't flinch, not on the tarmac, not on the ride to her hotel in a black Tesla SUV, not even when her phone began vibrating nonstop with messages from board members, clients, media outlets, and her mother, whose voice trembled when she finally called, whispering, "Baby, are you all right?" To which Amara could only smile faintly and reply, "I'm fine, Mom. I just told the truth out loud, and people finally listened." But that wasn't entirely true, because telling the truth had consequences, and they were coming fast. By the time she reached the Westin Grand and checked into her executive suite, CNN had requested an interview, MSNBC had her name in the lower third banner, and conservative networks were already accusing her of creating drama for social media attention, claiming that seat confusion was common and that this was just another race-baiting headline. Never mind the fact that the boarding pass was clear, the pilot's voice was decisive, and the only person who refused to comply was the one who believed status meant superiority. Amara poured herself a glass of still water, stood at the tall windows overlooking the Bay Bridge, and took a long breath, not because she was afraid, but because she needed to center herself before the next wave hit. She didn't want to be a viral moment, she didn't need the fame. What she wanted was to deliver her keynote at the Global Innovation Summit, lock in the federal cybersecurity contract, and push Fields Tech to the next stratosphere of influence. But now, the conversation was shifting, and she wasn't just a CEO anymore. She was being cast, rightly or wrongly, as a civil rights figurehead in a new digital era, and the weight of that wasn't light. Her team arrived 30 minutes later, wide-eyed and furious. Malik, her PR director, already on his second espresso and halfway through a crisis control strategy. and Hannah, her VP of Communications, who was toggling between Slack, Twitter, and internal legal threads faster than a day trader on cocaine. "We need to issue a statement," Malik said. "Not a weak one, a strong one. You own this moment." But Amara shook her head, sipped her water and said, "I don't need to issue anything. I didn't create this moment, it found me. Let the video speak for itself." But Hannah disagreed. "That works for now," she said. "But by tomorrow morning, every network is going to want your version, your voice, and if you don't define it, they will." That truth lingered like fog, so Amara agreed to a brief written statement, released on Field's text channels and her own personal page, reading, "Every person deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness regardless of their race, gender, or position. I didn't ask for attention, I asked for my seat. That it should never be a controversial act." Within 20 minutes, the statement was being quoted in Time, Business Insider, and The Atlantic. But while the public digested headlines, the summit committee scrambled behind the scenes. Sponsors whispered about increased security. Conservative speakers threatened to pull out, and one Silicon Valley exec on the summit's advisory board, someone who had once refused to fund Field's tech because "you're impressive, but we're looking for someone with a more traditional background," suggested they reconsider whether a keynote from Amara Fields would be unnecessarily polarizing. That was the moment Amara's fury bloomed, not the man on the plane, not the flight attendant's hesitation, but this, the cowardice of supposed allies who praised inclusion in press releases but recoiled the moment it became inconvenient. Janelle caught her pacing, fists clenched. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Amara turned slowly, voice low and steady. "I'm going to burn the stage down with facts, with power, and with a smile." The next morning she walked into the convention center like she owned it, which in many ways, she did. The summit was abuzz, cameras everywhere, protesters and supporters outside. Signs reading "She earned that seat" and "Black excellence can't be denied." When Amara took the stage, standing beneath a giant banner that read "The future of innovation," the audience rose to their feet before she said a word. She didn't begin with slides or stats. She didn't pitch or posture. She said, 3 days ago, I was asked to give up my seat. Not for safety, not for an emergency, but because someone thought they deserved it more. I didn't give it up, and I won't give it up here either. So let's talk about what it means to earn your seat at the table, in the boardroom, and in first class." The audience exploded. Her keynote was electric, mixing data security policy with personal truth, outlining how Field's Tech's patented AI system had already detected 700% more cyber threats than competitors, and why the federal government couldn't afford to choose familiarity over innovation, or bias over brilliance. By the time she finished, the entire room was on its feet again, including the very officials who'd once doubted her qualifications. That night, the summit signed a 3-year federal pilot program contract with Field's Tech, valued at $220 million. Back at the hotel, Malik grinned. "From a stolen seat to a federal contract in 48 hours, I've seen CEOs fall apart over less." Amara just smiled, her voice quiet. "They didn't steal the seat. They revealed what people think they're entitled to. I just reminded them what I earned." But even as the moment cooled, even as journalists moved on to the next trending topic, the ripple effects of Amara's flight refused to fade. The man who stole her seat, now identified as Richard Denham, a venture capitalist with a long history of microaggressions, was placed on indefinite leave from his firm. The flight attendant, who later confessed she panicked under pressure, issued a formal apology and was quietly reassigned. Captain Rios, the pilot who had enforced policy with fairness, received a commendation from the airline, and Amara Fields became more than a name in tech. She became a symbol, a mirror, a wake-up call, and a quiet force for change. But she didn't celebrate. She went back to her suite, opened her laptop, and started her next round of strategy documents. Because the war was bigger than a plane, bigger than a seat. The war was about space: who was allowed to take it, who was told to shrink, and who would fight to stay standing. After the summit's roaring success and the ink drying on the $220 million federal pilot contract, you'd think Amara Fields would finally get to breathe. But instead, the pressure only thickened, like the air before a thunderclap, because, with visibility came scrutiny, and the same corporate circles that had once ignored her now had her name taped to every strategy meeting, investor memo, and internal policy review across the tech sector, not out of admiration, but calculation, as CEOs began to realize that silence in the face of bias now carried a price tag. And Amara's refusal to be silent had disrupted more than a flight. It had disrupted the illusion that merit alone ran the world. And while the public praised her courage and elegance, behind closed doors, certain boardrooms whispered a different tone: too assertive, too polarizing, too political. For someone expected to build shareholder value, and thus began the backlash, cloaked in compliments, the corporate sabotage disguised as strategic concern. Because Amara had done the one thing they feared most. She had proven that unapologetic black leadership could not only rise but win, outsmart, outperform, and outlast. It began subtly, a week after the summit, with an anonymous op-ed in a prominent business magazine titled as "Activism Diluting Leadership." The piece didn't name Amara directly, but it danced around her flight incident, questioning whether emotional overreactions in hypersure moments should influence multi-million-dollar government contracts, and whether tech companies rooted in identity politics could sustain innovation long-term. And Amara recognized the move for what it was: the first shot in a shadow war where her excellence would be repackaged as instability, her moral clarity reframed as unpredictability, and her advocacy twisted into ambition run amok. Her board, once wholly supportive, began asking vague questions on calls. What's the long-term PR strategy for managing public perception? And do we feel that your recent visibility aligns with our brand's risk profile? And Amara, who had built FieldStack from a garage in Oakland with nothing but an old Dell and a dream, stared at their faces on the Zoom screen, all white save for Janelle, all guarded, all pretending to be concerned about image while really panicking about the shift in power they couldn't quite control. It got worse when an internal memo leaked one she hadn't written suggesting FieldStack was exploring a diversity-first hiring quota for leadership roles, which sparked backlash from conservative media and triggered a wave of hate, mail threats, and corporate clients quietly pulling back on projects for budgetary reevaluation. But Amara didn't flinch. Instead, she called a board meeting in person or Zoom, no hiding, just a long glass table overlooking the San Francisco skyline, where she stood, alone at the head, and said, "Let's talk plainly, because I didn't fight through every barrier in this industry just to tiptoe around fragile egos." One of the older board members, a gray-haired telecom billionaire named Wexler, tried to frame it as a concern about momentum fatigue, saying, "You've become a symbol, Amara, and symbols draw fire. We just want to ensure Field stays insulated." Amara looked him dead in the eye and replied, "I didn't become a symbol, I became visible. If that makes you nervous, then maybe the insulation isn't protecting the company, it's protecting you from seeing who's actually doing the work." There was a long silence before Janelle broke in with data: revenue up 31% quarter over quarter, customer retention at a record high, and product deployments 3 months ahead of schedule. "This company isn't surviving a storm," Janelle said. "It is the storm." Still, the attacks kept coming online: think pieces, YouTubers calling her a race hustler, bots flooding her social accounts with racist slurs, and even a former FieldStack intern claiming she was hostile during a performance review, twisting Amara's direct coaching into a narrative of intimidation, which made headlines for exactly 36 hours until HR records revealed that the intern had been let go for falsifying time logs. Meanwhile, Amara continued to build. She expanded the AI threat response division, launched a community upskilling program for women of color in tech, and landed a deal with the European Union to deploy FieldStack's cyber platforms across 4 member nations. And yet, every step forward came with a fresh round of resistance, and Amara began to feel the toll, not in her spine, which stayed straight, or her voice, which remained sharp, but in the quiet moments alone at night when her hands trembled from rage held too long, and the mirror reflected a woman who'd mastered armor so well she sometimes forgot what rest felt like. Malik noticed first. "You haven't slept," he said one night, dropping to oat lattes on her desk. "You don't have to carry this entire movement on your shoulders, you know." But Amara shook her head. "I'm not carrying a movement," she replied. "I'm carrying my company. I'm carrying proof." It wasn't until a week later, when FieldStack's annual general meeting approached, that the real storm broke. An activist investor group known for hostile takeovers had quietly purchased 4% of the company's stock and proposed a motion to split the CEO and chairperson roles, citing leadership concerns stemming from recent public controversies, which was corporate speak for "we don't like a black woman with too much power." If the motion passed, Amara would lose her executive authority over the board, reducing her to a symbolic figurehead while others controlled her vision. The news exploded across Bloomberg, CNBC, and every financial platform. Suddenly, the seat on the plane was being reframed as a spark for corporate instability, and board members began hedging. That night, Amara sat in her penthouse office staring out at the blinking lights of the city she had once walked through unnoticed, her phone full of journalists begging for comment and allies offering careful PR-approved support, but she didn't answer any of them. Instead, she wrote a speech not for the media, not for investors, but for the general meeting, one no one would see coming. When the day arrived, the conference room was filled to the brim: shareholders in tailored suits, reporters with press badges, and even a few quiet protesters outside holding signs that read "Let her lead." Amara stood at the podium, flanked by screens showing performance metrics and predictive growth models, and for a moment, she simply looked at the crowd before speaking. "3 months ago," she began, "someone tried to take my seat because they believed it belonged to them more than to me. That same belief is what fuels this motion today. Make no mistake, this isn't about governance. It's about power. It's about whether you trust the black woman who built this company to keep building it, or whether you're more comfortable putting reins on her now that she's succeeded." A murmur swept through the room. Amara continued, highlighting performance, innovation, investor return, client growth, undeniable. Then she closed with, "If you vote to separate my roles, you're not protecting FieldStack. You're protecting a fantasy that says success must always look like someone else. But I didn't come this far to let that fantasy rewrite what I've earned. The vote came down to the wire, but it failed. The motion was rejected 58 to 42. Amara retained full control. After the meeting, a journalist asked her, "Do you think this fight is over now?" Amara smiled without smiling. "This fight started long before that plane ride," she said. "And it won't end in a boardroom, but I'm still standing. And I'm still building." And with that, she turned and walked away, not just a CEO anymore. Not just a symbol, but something rarer, a woman who refused to surrender. No matter how high the pressure rose, no matter how many hands reached for the seat she rightfully claimed, because she demanded it, but because she earned it, over and over again. The sky above Los Angeles burned orange with dusk as Amara Fields stepped onto the rooftop of the Intercontinental Hotel, invited to keynote the Global Tech Equity Conference, a gathering of world leaders, investors, innovators, and activists, all pivoting toward the convergence of capital and conscience. And, though the skyline glittered like a promise, Amara walked with the calm of a storm that had passed through fire and emerged forged, not fractured. A woman no longer defined by the infamous flight that triggered her ascent, but by the unrelenting courage with which she'd kept climbing. Reshaping the rules of leadership, carving a space where none had existed before, and making sure no one could ever again pretend they didn't see her. The whispers had grown quieter now, not because the world had changed, but because she had made it impossible to ignore the weight of her results. Fields Tech had expanded to 8 countries, posted a 40% increase in quarterly revenue, led the largest AI security contract in U.S. military history, and launched a new education initiative bringing tech literacy into underserved urban and rural communities across 3 continents. And yet through it all, Amara never once deviated from the same unflinching clarity that had defined her from day one. If her presence in a room made people uncomfortable, it only proved how long that room had gone unchallenged. The conference buzzed with energy, but it was Amara's arrival that silenced the floor. Every camera swung to her, every voice lowered to a hush, and yet she moved as she always had, focused, composed, not asking for space but commanding it without a word. But behind the sleek optics and curated panels, another confrontation had been brewing, one not on the schedule because tonight, seated in the front row, wearing the same smug entitlement as that day on the plane, was Amanda Brighton, the white executive who had tried to steal Amara's seat all those months ago, now working as a VP at a rival tech conglomerate, having weathered her own PR storm only to be quietly repositioned by a network that always protected its own. She had filed a lawsuit for defamation after Amara's story went viral, claiming reputational damage and career obstruction. Though the case was quickly dismissed for lack of merit, still, she had been invited by an organizer who thought fostering healing meant putting oppressor and survivor on equal footing, as if time alone could erase power dynamics forged in humiliation and flight crew indifference. But Amara didn't flinch when she saw her. She simply nodded once, then stepped onto the stage. She began her keynote, not with tech forecasts or statistics, but with the story of a girl born to a single mother, who worked 2 cleaning jobs and still managed to teach her daughter code at the public library on weekends. A girl who had to pretend to be less smart to keep white classmates from complaining she was bossy. A girl who studied in silence while classmates doubted her every answer, who was told to apply to backup colleges just in case, and who once spent 3 weeks outside school suspension for defending her younger brother against racial slurs. That girl, Amara said, her voice steady, grew up to sit on the boards of the very companies that once denied her internship applications. That girl grew up to build technology that now protects the infrastructure of nations. The audience was silent, not out of politeness but reverence. Amara continued, pivoting to the infamous plane ride. Not as a story of personal indignity, but systemic rot. You can't steal a seat unless the world assumes you already own it, she said, looking directly at Amanda, whose smirk had frozen like a glitch on a corrupted file. Then came the surprise. Amara played the flight footage on the overhead screens. Video she had never released publicly. Footage from another passenger's phone, showing Amanda taking Amara's seat with a sneer and saying, "People like you always end up in the back," followed by the moment Amara calmly produced her boarding pass. The stunned silence of the flight attendant, and the crew's frantic radio call that grounded the plane. The room gasped, because it was no longer just a story, it was evidence, and the evidence spoke volumes about who was protected, who was believed, and who was expected to tolerate disrespect as a condition of existing. Amara let the silence breathe. "This isn't about a seat on a plane," she said, turning back to the crowd. "This is about every seat, every boardroom, every classroom, every hospital, courtroom, newsroom, and office where someone is told to shrink, to wait, to defer, because the world hasn't updated its assumptions." She didn't cry, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The room rose to its feet, not with applause, but awe after the speech. The CEO of a major Silicon Valley fund approached her and said, "That was the most important thing said on this stage in a decade. I want to invest in whatever you build." Next, she thanked him, but she didn't need his money. The demand for Fields Tech's global expansion had already outpaced projections. What she needed was sustainability for herself, for the girls watching, for the black and brown founders trying to rise without apology. And so, a month later, Amara announced the creation of the SEED Initiative, a $200 million fund dedicated solely to black women founders in tech, with support hubs in Nairobi, Atlanta, São Paulo, and New Orleans, each designed to train, mentor, and launch new ventures from women who had long been locked out, not due to talent, but to a system that refused to see them. Critics scoffed at the name, some called it petty, others called it political, but Amara smiled through it all, because she knew exactly what she was doing, reclaiming not just a moment, but a narrative. 1 year to the day after the infamous flight, Amara booked a seat on the exact same route, same airline, same flight number. When she boarded, the flight attendants stood in silence, then broke into a spontaneous round of applause, because they remembered her, and more importantly, they remembered the shift she had triggered in airline policy, requiring new anti-bias protocols, de-escalation training, and updated crew response procedures nationwide. As she took her seat 1A again, she pulled out her laptop, opened a new proposal, and titled it Skybound Equity, Phase 2. Across the aisle, a young black girl sat wide-eyed watching her. She looked maybe 14. "Are you famous?" she whispered. Amara leaned over and smiled. "No, sweetie, I'm just someone who stopped letting other people decide where I'm supposed to sit." And with that, the plane lifted into the sky, not grounded this time, not delayed, but flying forward, fast, with Amara Fields at the front, not because the world gave her that place, but because she took it, built it, defended it, and made damn sure the door stayed open behind her.